campus. So this is really great. Yeah, so kudos to all of you for coming and taking part of your Saturday morning to be out here today. I have a couple of goals today. One of them is to share some information about lake management, lake protection. Also to talk specifically about some data that has been collected on Spider Lake over many years through volunteer monitoring, which has been an impressive effort over the years. And also finally to leave you with some information about the various programs that Michigan State University offers through campus, through extension. And I know some of you picked up this publication that we have up front. I think we brought enough that just about everybody, or at least every household, can take one home. It's a catalog of all of the lake, stream, and watershed programs that MSU Extension offers. So many of the programs, in fact, all of the programs that I'll mention today, you can get more information about them in that catalog. And it'll direct you to our website for even more information. So yeah, let's dive in. And something I want to invite you to do is, if you have a question about anything that I'm talking about, interrupt me, raise your hands. I want this to have an element of discussion too. You know, we can only discuss so long because I want to keep you on schedule today, so you're not here all day. But you know, I'm happy to chat. And so one of the nice things about for working with lakes in this part of the state is that I do live in Traverse City, even though I'm employed by MSU. I've been there for about 11 years, and the last 3 years I've lived up here. I work with lake associations, the DNR, Eagle, the former DEQ, extensively on a statewide basis. So it doesn't really matter where my office is, as long as I'm on campus and have a vehicle that runs. I have both of those things, so, and a vehicle with a whole lot of miles on it. So, you know, we all love lakes. You wouldn't be here if you didn't love your lake. You wouldn't have came to the lake, or your family before you wouldn't have come to the lake, if there wasn't something about being on a lake that meant a lot to you. Michiganders love their lakes. We fish in them, we swim in them, we just like to look at them. We like to take our boats out, more and more we're kayaking on them, getting out there, and we like to share them with our family. And we love them so much. And I think all of us, if we picture a lake, a Michigan lake, you have an image in your head, and it's gonna look like Spider Lake for you. It's gonna look like these beautiful natural lakes with plant life and birds singing and frogs hopping about and a turtle poking its head up. That's what we love about Michigan lakes. However, they're not all in great shape, and part of that is because of how much we love them, right? We all want to be by a lake. We all want to go to the lake, live on the lake. If we don't live on the lake, we want to visit the lake, bring our families to the lake, bring our friends, our boats. We want to be on the lake. And so that can cause some issues. That can cause issues like overdevelopment, loss of shoreline habitat, too much nutrients running off into our lake, things like fertilizers and soils and things making their way into the lake. And that can really change the lake in ways that we don't want. You can have terrible algae blooms happening. You can have invasive plants moving in. Does anybody recognize that plant up in the corner? Yeah, that's Eurasian water milfoil. We actually have 8 milfoil species in Michigan, and 2 of them are not native. The others are native. We have lots of really cool native milfoil plants, but Eurasian is one that we've all kind of heard about as a problematic invader. And things that we do in the landscape change things that can lead to flooding, can lead to erosion of the shorelines and things like that. So we need to be focused on how much we're loving the lakes and making sure we're thinking about the lakes and not just our own needs and when we're using our lakes. So there's been a lot of research done on what is impacting our lakes, and this slide kind of gets to that. This is work done by the Michigan DNR looking at lakes all across the state. And what this is telling us is that we put a lot of houses on our lakes, especially in southern Michigan, but as you go north. So what it's showing you here is the light colored bars. This is southern Michigan, so kind of Gaylord south. And so what you have here is that very few lakes are undeveloped in the southern part of the state. That shouldn't surprise you. And then a fair amount, about 30%, have 1 to 10 homes per kilometer, and then almost 80% have more than 10 homes per kilometer. It's a little different in the north. We have more natural shorelines on our lakes, but still, we have more lakes are developed than are undeveloped. And that's an indicator of how much pressure is on those lakes from human use on those lakes. And that's only going to increase as people keep moving up. Another piece of data. Every 5 years, the federal government, through the EPA, does a national lake assessment. They go out on lakes all over in all 50 states and collect tons and tons of data. It was last done in 2017. The data I'm showing you here are from 2012, because that's the last data that are available to me. And what they were able to determine by looking at the lakes in Michigan is that there are some very serious, as our projector starts ringing, a very specific threat to Michigan's lakes, and that is the loss of lakeshore habitat. What this is showing us right here at the top is that lakeshore habitat complexity has been lost on over 50% of our lakes in Michigan. And when our lakeshores become simple, no logs, no plants, no rocks, just seawalls and sand maybe, you can imagine that's not very good fish habitat. You're not gonna see turtles and frogs hanging around there, the birds don't have anything to eat, and it becomes kind of a biological desert. So that's the number one threat that the EPA has determined is threatening Michigan's lakes, is that loss of lakeshore habitat. The second threat is mercury contamination, and the third threat is high nutrients. So that's where we're at. So what can we do about it? One of my roles at Michigan State is helping to run Michigan's Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. It's the second oldest citizen lake monitoring program in the nation. We started in 1974. Only one state beat us. Can you guess who? Minnesota. By 1 year. They started their program in 1973. People always guess them or Wisconsin, and both are fair guesses. Wisconsin has a really strong program too. But anyway, we've been doing it since 1974. That's incredible. That's 45 years of data on so many lakes, hundreds of lakes in Michigan, far beyond what any of our agencies have the capacity to do, and much more frequently than any of our agencies are able to visit a lake. You know, we have amazing biologists with the state of Michigan that go out and monitor our lakes, but there's only so many of them, and they all can be in so many places at once. When we work with volunteers who live on or spend time on lakes regularly, you can collect information so much more frequently for these lakes and on an annual basis. So we've been working hard to keep this program going. It's a vital program for Michigan, and the state relies on it too. It's not just the individual lakes using the data themselves. The DNR and Eagle both look at these data carefully when they're deciding on lake management plans, where they're going to stock fish. All of this information is publicly available and used. And so we offer training to our volunteers to get out there and learn about water quality sampling, how to assess the health of the lake, how to identify invasive species, in order to collect data about their lakes. So, and as I mentioned, it's called the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. And this program is one half of what we call the Michigan Clean Water Corps. Michigan Clean Water Corps includes our lake monitoring program and also a volunteer stream monitoring program. So there's a complementary program that focuses on rivers and streams. It's not nearly as old as the lakes program. It's been going since about the 90s. So here we are, and what's exciting is that we have a lot of lakes involved. Every little speck you see on there in the state of Michigan is a lake that was enrolled in the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program this year. 287 lakes, pretty exciting. Given the fact that when I talk to our DNR biologists, they're able to get out to maybe 40 lakes per year. And they can't get out to any lake every year. You know, so they're doing amazing work, and they collect really, high-tech data and information really in depth. But that is a great complement to what our volunteers are doing on their lakes.
How many total lakes in Michigan?
Good question. If you call them any lake that's 5 acres or larger, we're at about 11,000. So we could add a whole lot more lakes. More than 10,000 lakes, right? Minnesota, take that. So, you can see up here in our part of the state, we've got a lot of involvement, which is excellent. It's really great. You might also see a real crowd of lakes down here. That's Oakland County. Oakland County has more lakes than any county in the whole state of Michigan. A lot of people don't realize that a county down by Detroit would have more lakes than any place else. But if you're familiar at all with Oakland County, you know there's a lot of lakes down there. And not a single straight road, because there's so many lakes and the roads have to go around them. But Oakland County, last year and this year, the county actually saw this program is so important that they subsidized it for their volunteers. Our volunteers pay a few bucks per parameter, and we'll talk about that, to be involved. The average lake, it costs about $150 a year. And Oakland County said, we want you guys to do it, we'll foot the bill. And we've had a huge explosion of volunteerism in Oakland County as a result, which has been great. Because the county chipped in. They said, this is important. Plus, they helped get the word out about this opportunity. So that's our map, but now let's focus in on the program itself. And I'm gonna go through each of these in reference to Spider Lake. But these are the different variables or parameters, programs that volunteers can get involved with. Looking at water clarity, looking at phosphorus in the lake, which is a nutrient that can, in excess, can cause nuisance plant growth. Invasive plants, chlorophyll. You can look at chlorophyll in the water to see how much algae is floating in your water column. They look at dissolved oxygen and temperature in the lake, looking at aquatic plants, and also the shoreline, a program called Score the Shore. And Spider Lake has done a lot of these programs. Not all of them, but most of them. So there's a method behind the madness of our program. All these things we're measuring. Each of them are interesting individually, but also they tell us something called trophic status about a lake. So a little vocabulary for you on your Saturday morning. Lake scientists talk about lakes and put them in 3 different categories: oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic. An oligotrophic lake is a lake that's low in productivity. Productivity meaning growth of plants, fish, algae, how productive is your lake? And so if you have a low productivity lake, an oligotrophic lake, it's gonna seem pretty clear. Here's our diver, you can see her really well, it's nice and clear. There's some fish in there, but not a ton, not much plant life, and you can kind of see to the bottom. And then as you move up the scale of productivity, we have our middle ground, kind of our mesotrophic lake, which has more fish, more plants, but it's not chock full of them. And then we have eutrophic lakes. You can barely see our diver there. The water's pretty cloudy, there's a lot of algae in the water column, a lot of plants, the bottom might fill in, it might be kind of shallow because there's a lot of organic matter that settles to the bottom. You may have a different fish community. It's going to be a little more weedy in there, a little more shallow. Now, all of these lakes are natural, all of these lakes are good. They're just different. It's not a value judgment on what kind of lake it is. But this is a process that lakes actually will go through called lake aging, where over centuries or even millennia, they tend to move in this direction. They'll start to fill in, they'll become more productive, the water may get a little cloudier, a little greener. That's okay, but it should be happening really slowly on the landscape. What we don't want to have happen is that the process is sped up by a process we call cultural eutrophication, where things that we're doing on the landscape is adding nutrients, sediment, invasive species, that kind of thing. So lakes move from that low productivity state to that high productivity state while we watch. Like it happens very quickly. And that's what we're looking for in many of these monitoring programs. Going out 1 year and collecting water samples is interesting, but it's not necessarily the whole story. What's really interesting is to take samples over the course of several years to see what path you're on. Are you getting more productive, less productive? Is your lake getting clearer or cloudier over time? That's what's really valuable. So we look at the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program as a long-term monitoring program. You want people in for the long haul because it's those trends that can really tell you what might be going on in your lake. That make sense? Yeah, okay, cool. All right, so if we get eutrophication, especially the cultural kind that happens really quickly, here's a icky algae bloom lake right there, you can see it picking up. We get nuisance algae, we might get fish kills, we might get a weedy lake that we don't really want to go boating or swimming in. We might lose oxygen in the lake, which can exacerbate some of these effects. People don't want to buy houses on those lakes anymore, so property values can go down. These are some of the things that are associated with that cultural eutrophication, that unnatural aging of a lake. So I've dug into Spider Lake's data, the data that's been collected by volunteers over many years. And so I found that over time, some monitoring has been going on in some form or the other since the 90s on Spider Lake. And in several different locations. This is the main location right here. This is where current monitoring is happening. In the past, there's some data from a few of these other holes, and there's one little sample that was collected once from Celery Bay. But in general, the work is being done here, and that's the data I'm going to present to you. Now, one of the rules of our Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program is that data about water quality needs to be collected in the deepest spot in the lake. That's where we want you to collect, and that's how these sites were identified, these holes in the lake. Why we do that is because lake water tends to mix at certain times of year, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And if you sample over the deepest spot, you're going to get the most representative sample. that will represent conditions in a whole lake. Now in complicated lakes like Spider, with lots of bays and coves and channels and that kind of thing, you can have some variation. But the standard used by lake scientists around the world is to focus on that deep spot in the lake. And we want to be in keeping with those standards. So let's look and see what we've learned about Spider Lake over the years. The most basic measurement of lake health is to look at its transparency with something called a Secchi disc. How many of you have seen one of these fellas before? Have you seen those? Yeah, some of you have. It's an 8-inch disc with black and white quadrants on it, and it's very simple, low tech. You just lower it down into the water column and record how deep it was when you couldn't see it anymore. That's it. What that tells us is the water cloudy? Is there a lot of algae in the water column? Is there, what might be going on? Maybe there's a lot of sediment suspended. In some of our UP lakes, this measurement can be a little challenging because they're really stained. You've seen Tawamina Falls look like root beer, right? Because they're really stained by the leaves and organic matter that comes from the bogs around those lakes. But for lakes in the Lower Peninsula, this is a really good measurement of the health of a lake. So we asked our volunteers to measure this at least every other week during the course of the summer, May to September, to see how things are going out there in that deep spot. And here, and I'll walk you through this, is data that I found in our CLMP database. Starting in 1980, there was a measurement, and then nobody did it again for like several years. And then people have been measuring it, and this is an average, June to August. I just looked at the middle of the summer. And here's what we're seeing here. On this side of the graph is the depth of the lake. So this is kind of the top of the lake, and this is the bottom of the lake. And so back in 1980, the average, you could see down over 19 feet. That's pretty impressive. And it's gotten a little bit less clear over time. This last measurement was our 2017 monitoring. So it's not as clear as it was way back in 1980. But something I want to draw your attention to, if we look at all these data, we might say, okay, it's gotten a little worse, a little less clear over time. But something I noticed, if we just look at recent years, it really hasn't changed very much. That's actually pretty flat if you were to take an average of where all those dots are. Even here in 2017, where it looks like it was sitting at about 13 and a half feet. First of all, being able to see down 13 and a half feet is pretty impressive. That's why I love Michigan lakes, right? Most of them are so clear and so beautiful. But even then, it doesn't show, to me, as a scientist looking at this data, I don't say, oh no, Spider Lake, terrible sign. No, I don't think so. I think there's the proof that maybe there's more people living around the lake full time now, and there's more pressure on the lake that happened kind of in the 90s. But since 2000 or so, it's been pretty flat, really. And this is why it's so valuable to have many years of data, because you don't just look at one spot and go, what does that mean? We have many years of data to look at. So that's one part of the story.
How does that compare with some of the other lakes in the area, just briefly?
That's a good question. It's pretty similar. It's pretty similar. And what we do find with some lakes, we sometimes see a blip when zebra mussels appear in the lake, because they make it clearer. So we'll actually see an improvement in clarity when zebra mussels come in. I don't really see a strong signal of that here. But on other lakes that that were really hit hard by zebra mussels, you'll see, oh my gosh, the lake got dramatically clearer for a while as a result. But yeah, Spider Lake is right up there, doing well. Phosphorus. The next thing to talk about is phosphorus, a nutrient. Here's a picture of a volunteer on a different lake collecting a water bottle. And that's simply all that's required, is collecting a bottle of water 2 times a year. It's frozen and turned into us. And then the state environmental lab in Lansing does the analysis to actually determine how much phosphorus is in the water column. And so why do we care about phosphorus? For lakes, there's really 2 key nutrients that are required for life in lakes: nitrogen and phosphorus. And that probably sounds familiar if you've ever bought fertilizer for your garden or your lawn. Nitrogen and phosphorus are both really important to lakes. In the vast majority of Michigan's lakes, there's plenty of nitrogen. That's not a problem. It's the level of phosphorus that we call the limiting nutrient. Phosphorus is what we need to keep an eye on, because even just a little bit of extra phosphorus can cause you to go from this experimental lake with low phosphorus, high phosphorus. And you can see the pea soup effect, the adding extra phosphorus to this lake on this side of this experimental curtain that was put in a lake, can make a difference in the water quality. That was the only difference, was adding some phosphorus to this experiment. And so that's what we want to keep an eye on. We don't want extra phosphorus getting into our Michigan lakes because that can cause a real change in how productive that trophic status of our lake.
What about the 15 and 30 on the phosphorus sign there?
You know, that's interesting. This is an image that was taken from a periodic table, so that's actually like the atomic number off the periodic table, and it's atomic weight. So if you really want to dig into chemistry, that's
But it's not an indication of what an average level should be and what a bad level.
No, that's not what those numbers indicate. Good question, really good question.
Is that phosphorus sample, do you take that from the deepest part of the lake?
That's correct. Yep, right there in the deepest spot. And as I mentioned, we take them 2 times a year, and here's why. Lakes stratify. Basically a lake, this time of year, right now, if you went out into the deep spot of the lake, it would be like a layer cake if you looked at the water, especially based on temperature. And you've all done that, right? You've gone swimming and you're up swimming around at the surface, it's nice and warm, but maybe your toes hang down in the deep water and it's super cold down there. That's what our lakes do. They will actually stratify. So we have nice warm water at the top in the summer, cold water down here, and there's a transition area in between, and sometimes that gets pretty tight. Now what's interesting about this is not only do lakes divide into these temperature layers in the summer, they flip over twice a year. It happens once in the spring and once in the fall. And what we're interested in is the one that happens in the spring. First you have ice, right? It's been frozen all winter. When the lake is frozen, it's pretty much the same temperature from top to bottom. It's very consistent. But then the ice breaks up, spring winds are blowing, and the top of the lake starts heating up because you got sun coming on, the ice is off, and the cold water on the bottom, it will turn over and mix that lake all up. And then as the top continues to heat over the summer, you get this layer cake happening. And then at the fall, when the air starts to cool off, you're heading into winter, it'll turn over again and mix up with those fall winds, and again, you won't have the layer cake anymore. Really interesting, right? So we collect our phosphorus. Oh, actually I had a picture. I didn't have to illustrate it with my hands. I have a photo. But again, it's making this point again that in the summer, where we are right now, we have our layer cake, where it's cold on the bottom, warm on the top. In the fall, it's going to mix all up and be the same. In the winter, it's going to be pretty much the same with a nice ice layer on top. And then in the spring, it's going to mix again when the ice comes off. So we have you collect phosphorus sample once right here in the spring within 2 weeks of the ice melting to see what the total amount of phosphorus is in your lake. And then we have you collect another one in the summertime right now, or actually a little bit later. We'll do it in August, early September, when the lake is really divided up, and to see just how much productivity is actually happening. So really the spring measurement is about potential and the summer measurement is about reality.
What level are you measuring in the summertime? Above or below the thermal
You're
climb?
gonna be above it. We just have you put your arm in about to your elbow.
Oh,
So
okay,
you're gonna
so-
be at that warmest, most productive part of the lake.
That's
And
easy.
yep, it's easy, yeah, exactly. It's a little chilly this time, because the ice has just come off the lake, but it's easy for summer. Okay, so phosphorus, what have we seen in Spider Lake? So the first date I'm showing you here, this has started a little more recently in the mid to late 90s. Spring measurements, they vary a little bit, and this is normal. We see them hopping around in any lake. That's again why we look over time. But overall, you know, it's really pretty consistent. There's a couple higher measurements up in here in more recent years, but really quite consistent. And this is a very low level of phosphorus. Not the lowest I've seen, but quite low. And so again, nothing to be alarmed about here. And this is looking at our potential, what the potential Spider Lake has of being productive later that summer. But then we also look at how productive it actually was. And again, besides this one weird year back in 2000, really consistent from the late 90s up until 2017. Again, this is a fairly low productivity, no trend, so I'm not seeing, oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of extra nutrients coming into Spider Lake, quick, everyone stop fertilizing their lawns. Hopefully you're not anyway, but you know, those kinds of things. We're not seeing a huge, any kind of trend. We're not seeing it getting better, but we're not seeing it getting worse.
That was on Spider Lake,
Mm-hmm.
and that is one monitoring location or several?
One. We
And
have
the one
data
that's
from
at
some
the
of the other
deepest part of the
locations.
lake?
Yes, the deepest one.
Present?
Yep, that's correct. Yep, there is some data from some of those other spots on the lake I showed you. I didn't pull those out for today, just in the interest of time. So again, I see good news here. Spider Lake, you're holding your own, and that's good. What else do we know? Chlorophyll. We do chlorophyll measurements to see what that phosphorus is actually doing in the lake. Is it creating algae in the water column? So chlorophyll, of course, is that green pigment in all green plants that helps with photosynthesis. And so if we have a lot of little microscopic algae that live in the water column, they all produce chlorophyll. So we make really cool samplers. You can sort of see there out of juice cans and bottles and dumbbell weights. You can buy really expensive versions of this from biological supply companies, but these work really great and are cheap. So we work with the volunteers to collect samples because just at the surface isn't enough. We want to sample from the water column, anywhere we might get algae. So we actually have you sample to twice that transparency you measured with a Secchi disc. So we looked at a measurement that was about 13 feet. So you would lower that guy down to 26 feet and collect some water all the way going up. And that's how you collect all of that area of the lake that may have algae floating in the water column, okay? So you collect that sample, and then you filter it onto a little piece of filter paper. That gets frozen and sent to our lab for analysis for chlorophyll. The amount of chlorophyll helps us estimate the amount of algae. These measurements are taken 5 times in the middle of May, June, July, August, and September, because the algae community changes in the lake over the course of the summer, and gives us, again, an indication of how productive the lake is. Here's some pictures of algae, and I'm going to mention something, because I know there's a lot of discussion about algae on Spider Lake. Not all algae are bad. In fact, a lot of algae are good. They're really important parts of the lake food web. Insects, small fish require algae to survive. And so we need algae in our lakes. We might not want this much algae in our lakes, but you know, they're beautiful, very interesting parts of our lakes, and I think they get a bad rap a lot of times. And so I think that's an important kind of message to take away, that just because we might notice some algae in our lake, or might notice some algae on the rock or floating in the water, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good to be alert and pay attention to any changes that you might see. But in general, algae is really important. But changes in the algae can be an indication that excess nutrients are getting in your lake. So here's chlorophyll. If anything, you're getting less and less and less and less and less over the years. So this monitoring started again in about 1997 and has been sampled all the way up to 2017. And the trend is for less algae in your water column over time. That sounds good to me too, right? Yeah, pretty good with that?
I've noticed more algae blooms in recent years. What's the relationship there? You're saying some algae is good. Is that bloom actually a healthy indication?
It certainly could be. And in fact, I know that some algae has been collected from the lake and sent in for identification. And I think somewhere in here I have pictures of some of the algae from Spider Lake. And they found it to be all native, all healthy green algae, not the harmful blue-green algae you may have heard of. So we might be seeing more of it and at certain times of year, but there's no indication that they're harmful types of algae.
That's good to know.
Yeah. I was glad to hear it too.
That's your water quality committee at work.
My question is, if you see the floating loose plants, because I live in an area where the wind brings.
Pushes them in, sure.
Yeah, especially loading days when there's high traffic, you see a lot of broken plants floating.
Sure.
Is it really recommended to remove those from the water's edge and throw them up on shore? Or is it really recommended to leave them alone? Or what is your thought on that?
You're welcome to pull them out, you know, because those broken off plants are going to settle to the lake bottom. They will, you know, decompose and become kind of mucky. And so from a purely kind of aesthetic or, you know, appearance wise, it's nice to not have to mess with that in front of your property. And it's really not going to harm the lake to pull them out. It won't harm the lake to leave them in either, because they're a natural part of the lake. So I don't discourage people from pulling them out if it's starting to pile up in front of your property. You know, if someone was to leave them there, it's not going to have a negative impact. It's really your own preference. Yeah.
What would you estimate the drop in the chlorophyll count is due to? Or,
You know, that's a good question. Why are we seeing less chlorophyll? Now, one thing I'll point out here is even though we're seeing a decline, this is on parts per billion, and maybe on average we're dropping from 4 to 5 to 2 to 3. Those are really teensy amounts overall in the big scheme of things. I've definitely seen lakes in southern Michigan that are at 15, 20, 25, 30, you know, and you all have never been even close to that in Spider Lake. So even though it's a decline, it's not a huge decline as far as one that might show a difference.
Zebra mussels became more evident about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
That's an important point, yeah, I was gonna get to that as a.
Filter feeding.
That's exactly right. So zebra mussels are filter feeders and they love algae in the water column. And so they'll eat those up, and that's why a lot of our lakes see clearer water when zebra mussels come in, because they filter that algae out. So that certainly could be one of the causes, certainly. All right. And so, I'm swinging back to this slide again that you already saw, because we use the data from the Secchi disk, from the phosphorus in the summer, and the chlorophyll to actually calculate a number that we call the trophic status of your lake. And Michigan actually has definitions of what number of trophic status qualifies a lake as oligotrophic, mesotrophic, or eutrophic for management purposes. And so we are able to use that data, and so we looked at Spider Lake. And what we found was that back in the 80s to 2011, the average trophic status that we calculated, and these numbers will make sense in a minute, was 37. 2012 to 2016, it dropped a little bit to 33. 2017, it was back to 37. So really that hasn't changed very much, because here's our little ruler, our scale, that tells us whether a lake is low productivity, oligotrophic, just like the last slide I showed you, moving this direction towards eutrophic, or even hypereutrophic, when you've got a real pea soup pond, that would be up there. So we call it oligotrophic, super low productivity, if it's 36 or less. And here's where you've been. You're right there, you're oligotrophic, maybe a little bit moving towards mesotrophic, but I see two things there. First of all, you're way down on this end of the scale. Second of all, it's been really consistent for a really long time. And so that's another good sign for Spider Lake. You guys are doing something. Good job, good job. We're not seeing that cultural eutrophication where we see a lake moving this direction while we're alive to see it happen. I've seen lots of lakes in our program that you can visually see it moving and see that cultural eutrophication. We're not seeing it here, okay? So that's just one point. There's lots of other things we can look at as far as lake protection and lake monitoring. Some of our lakes, not Spider to this point, have collected dissolved oxygen and temperature profiles, again at that deepest spot in the lake, to see how much oxygen is in the water, and why would we want oxygen in our water? Fish, yeah, fish need oxygen. And the whole food web relies on having plenty of oxygen. And also the temperature. And those temperature profiles can let us know about that layer cake stratification, what's happening in your lake over time. And it's quite interesting. And so we actually have handheld meters that we loan out to volunteers. You can see some volunteers holding them in their hand. They have a long cable with a sensor on the end. And you'll take a measurement right below the surface, and then every few feet all the way down to almost the bottom to get a profile of how oxygen and temperature change from the surface to the bottom. One of the things that can tell us is if there's any oxygen at the bottom of the lake. Some lakes lose their oxygen, especially in the middle of the summer at the bottom of the lake. It gets really cold down there, and especially if there's a lot of dead plants and stuff that are decomposing on the lake bottom, that decomposition eats up oxygen, those bacteria use up oxygen. And if we don't have oxygen at the bottom, it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just something to be aware of. You know, if you have no oxygen at the bottom, I wouldn't try and fish at that depth, because fish are gonna be hanging out down there, they're gonna wanna stay up higher like these fish are. We also have some interesting chemistry that can happen in a lake with no oxygen at the bottom. If there's no oxygen at the bottom of the lake, any phosphorus that's kind of hanging out down here in the sediment at the bottom becomes soluble and released into the water column. So we've seen lakes that don't have any big source of nutrients and phosphorus going in, but we're seeing a lot more algae and not sure why that was happening. Well, it turns out they were getting phosphorus from their own lake bottom that was coming up during these no oxygen periods. And that's what was causing, we call it legacy phosphorus, you know, nutrients that went in there decades ago and just been sitting there all, you know, snug and happy by themselves. But then when oxygen disappeared, chemistry happened, oxygen was gone, phosphorus was released into the water column, and the algae were having a field day. So it's an interesting piece of the puzzle. If If you all were seeing a lot more algae, your chlorophyll was going way up, but your phosphorus wasn't, this is what I would recommend that you do, is look at this. It's not though, that's not what we're seeing in your lake. So this may, you know, I wouldn't push you real hard to do it, but it is an interesting kind of way to learn more about the dynamics of your lake. So that is an option. Oops, I didn't click through my little things. But what it's saying there is phosphorus and iron, which is Fe, are bound together until you take the oxygen away. And then it releases the phosphorus.
Joe, can I ask you a question? If you were concerned about the lack of oxygen at the bottom and you were interested in irrigating to add more oxygen, what kinds of environmental concerns would be involved in looking at a permit for that?
So aeration, so putting in a bubbler or some kind of pump to add
Right.
oxygen to a lake.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things to think about
Okay.
with adding oxygen in a lake through an aeration system. A lot of that, you know, and the science is just starting to be published and understood about the impacts they can have. And there's a lot of different designs. Some of them are just kind of at the surface adding some oxygen, others are doing deep water oxygenation. Adding the oxygen can help with decomposing muck, if there's excess muck on the stream bottom. But it can also really mix up the food web as far as relocating, physically blowing things around the lake. That's a problem that some lakes have seen. And you know, there's impacts on the algae itself. There's a lot of different kind of cascading things that can happen in the lake by adding a bubbler. So, you know, getting permits can be challenging because of that.
Okay, that's what I was afraid of.
But we don't need to do that, right? But we don't need to do that.
I wouldn't recommend it. No, I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, that was my question, is do we even need to consider that?
Adding oxygen, no, I don't see any
So there's no reason
clues.
for doing that in Spider Lake?
Not that I can see. Not that I can see. Remember when we talked about the biggest threat to our lakes in Michigan? Loss of shoreline habitat. And so we added just a few years ago, this is the newest part of the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program, is our Score the Shore program. And Score the Shore allows volunteers to basically ride in a boat around their lake and fill out a report card about 1,000-foot sections of lake shore. And this was done for Spider Lake in 2017. There's a ton of data in the database. I started to go through it. There was so much that I wasn't able to do a lot with it in time to pull it out for you. But what we did, and the kinds of things that we look for, I'll back up a little bit, the kinds of things that you would look for when filling out that report card is things like, what's the shoreline look like? Is it quite natural? Is there a seawall? Is it a lawn? Or are there shrubs and native plants? Also looking in the water. Is there native plants growing in the water? Are there logs for fish to hide under and turtles to sun on? Is there erosion? Can you see that there's active erosion happening? Those kinds of things. And that all calculates into a score for that section of the lake. And then we can even calculate an average score for the whole lake. So here's an example, not Spider Lake obviously, this is Deer Lake, and it made the cover of the Riparian magazine back in 2014 when we first added this program. They did the survey, this is down in Oakland County, and they did the survey, and actually this little image shows their scores, that basically the solid lines, these green solid sections, scored good. The ones with dash lines scored fair. Nothing was poor or extremely impacted on this lake. They use this data to go to their township and oppose a big development that was likely to impact an area that was already only in the fair category. It was really interesting that they were able to do this, and that, as I understand it, the township listened carefully and actually adjusted their plans for this development based on the risk of impact to the quality of the lake. That's exactly what we wanted to have happen. The people are using that data locally to protect their lake shore. It also helps for individual property owners. You might look and go, oh, I'm in a section that lost some points because there's too much lawn in our section. You know, it doesn't pick on individual properties. It looks at 1,000-foot sections and say, you know, I could increase my score if only I put in some native plants. Or, you know, if a tree falls, I let it stay in the lake because it's not bothering me. It's not in the way of my boat. I can leave it there, and the fish are going to hang out there, and the insects are going to love it, and that kind of thing. So it helps people think about, well, what could I do, either as an individual or as a community, to help improve the shoreline habitat. So I'll back up again. I looked at the data from Spider Lake. It came out as a 70 was the score. It's a 0 to 100 scale. It scored a 70 for the whole lake. Of course, there's variation from one part of the lake to the next. You can go to the Micor website and dig into that if you really want to see where your part of the lake falls.
100 good or bad?
100 is the best. And that would be a lake with no houses on it. It would be impossible for Spider Lake to score 100. Even if y'all were doing everything right. You know, that's where there's nothing, there's no docks, there's just nothing. So what's realistic for Spider Lake is probably that, 70, 80, 85 kind of score, I would guess. You'd have to be in the, hidden somewhere in the UP to have 100.
Joe,
Yes.
may I interject here that the Water Quality Committee will send out the link through our association's new email to a direct link to go for our specific scores online. You can follow it down to where your property is.
Yeah,
It's a little tricky, but it can be done.
Yeah, and I can help with that too.
Hey, Joe, just
Yeah.
so we love to be at 85 or love to be at 100. So is there been a determination of what we can do to get Spider Lakes grade up higher, like in priority? Like if we're gonna get to this 85 score, in order, these are the things that each of us should look at to change or to continue to do.
Yeah, and I didn't have time to dig into every little section
Sure.
to see that, but overall what I saw was what we often see, is that there's certain sections where there's a whole lot of lawn and not much else. So there's work that could be done there. Perhaps some places where there was some visible erosion happening, that there could be some lake-friendly erosion control put in, not necessarily seawall, but maybe planting some native plants, putting some shrubs in that will hold that sediment in place. And I noticed the Shoreland Stewards sign up there on the table. There's an excellent website, the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, and it's in that catalog. You can get to it through there. That provides a lot of information for how to be a good shoreland steward, what you can do to protect your shoreline, and it even has a questionnaire you can go through, and that's how you could potentially earn one of those signs, by answering questions about what you're doing on your own property. And it can be anonymous, it will let you say, I do this, oh, I don't do that, and then it'll give you recommendations right there, instantly, which is really cool. It was put together by MSU, the DNR, some of our partners, so it's a really nice resource. So I'd direct you there to check out what you can do on your own property. Yes?
And I believe that you all received that in your June newsletter. It was an insert.
Oh, good, good. Yes.
Maybe you said it and I didn't pick it up. The Deer Lake one that's pictured there with seeing that graphic, what was their overall score?
Good question. Their overall score was,
If you know it.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I remember exactly what it was. I'd have to go in and look. This is an Oakland County lake. There's a lot of development down here in this part and over here, but then they're lucky to have some, like a nature preserve up in this area, that there's very little development, so that helped their overall score.
And to piggyback that, if I'm understanding how this all works, we're originally from downstate, where more of the lakes have like the manicured lawns and beaches and that. That detracts from your
You bet.
overall score.
Yes, yes. So things that lose score are seawalls, artificial beach where people bring in sand, having no wood in the lake, no logs and sticks and that kind of thing, killing all the aquatic vegetation, things like that. That's where you're losing points.
If I can just
Sure.
get a total understanding. If I read, or I think one of the presentations that we went to said that you can have, like, we have small grandkids and we want them safely to get into the water.
Mhm.
And there is, I thought, a certain small percentage that you can have and still be. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. You gotta be able to enjoy your lake, right? You wanna be able to swim and so forth. Remember, these scores are based on 1,000-foot sections. So we look at the whole thing. We don't go in and say, oh, this person has a 20-foot swimming area, they fail. No, not at all. We want people to be able to enjoy. And I'm not gonna give you like a specific percentage of your shoreline that you should keep natural versus not. But, I ask everybody to think carefully, what do you really need? What do you need to be able to enjoy it versus, oh, it might kind of look nice and neat, but we don't swim over there. Let's let that be natural. That's the question I ask everyone to ask themselves.
Awesome, thank you.
Joe, East Bay Township Forest Lakes Overlay has some very specifics, which are good practice environmental measures that they have put into law that they're urging people to follow,
Oh,
that
good.
reflect what you're mentioning would be good practices for
Good.
lakes.
That's good, good.
And we have copies here if you want to take them afterwards of that East Bay Township overlay.
I was going to point out, I had gone Wednesday evening to a seminar by Dr. Catherine Zimmerman on creating meadows. And she opened with the statement that a lawn is an ecological desert. Everything that you put on that lawn washes into water somewhere.
Yep, that's a great point. Absolutely, yes.
You know, we put in a sea law, it's called riprap, and some of the things you talked about, there are rocks, 15 to 20 inches, and the erosion from the large ski boats. It's amazing to watch the wave come in and it absorbs that wave. Either side of it got cement walls, and it's amazing. It splashes up onto the surface.
Sure, yeah.
But it also is a fish habitat. I'm surprised at the number of fish that are in and out of that rock.
In the riprap, yeah. Yeah, and if you dug into, if you go to the CLNP website, you can actually look at the data forms for score the shore, and, you can tell from the scoring that, having that vertical wall is really the most unnatural, maybe the most, and maybe damaging to the lakeshore. And as you said, a wave will hit it and jump over and it'll dig out beneath it. But if it's a riprap that's got some slope, that's got some benefits to it. Like you said, it's gonna absorb those waves a little more. Fish may be able to use it as habitat. And so there's some thoughtful things about designing that can still, if you're in an area that gets high energy, you can't just put a plant in there. It's not gonna be enough, and I understand that. But that slope and having it be an uneven surface can be more natural and at least, be better than having that vertical wall. That's a really good observation. I'm gonna move on here. And I think I get back to shorelines again at the end. Then finally, the other programs in the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program are our plant survey programs. We have one that focuses just on invasive species that we call the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch. That's only looking for 5 species of plants. Eurasian milfoil, curly-leaf pondweed, frogbit, hydrilla, and which one am I forgetting? Starry stonewort. Those are the 5 that we teach our volunteers to look for in this program, and it involves tossing a rake head on a rope into the lake and pulling it up and seeing if you're finding any of those invasive plants. Spider has not done this program yet. They did start the Aquatic Plant Identification and Mapping Program several years ago, where you actually look both at invasive and native plants in the lake. This is much more labor intensive. It requires a lot more identification of plants because you're looking at all the natives as well. But the outcome is you get a really detailed map of your lake of what kind of plants are living where. It's interesting at that time, but really valuable down the road because you can look for changes. If you do the survey again and say, oh, we're getting a lot more plants over in this end, I wonder what's going on there. Or these natives have been replaced by invasives. That's something to be aware of in your management. So this is an opportunity that Spider Lake could get into again. I've talked about the value of aquatic plants. This is a picture I like to show because it's milfoil, but it's not Eurasian milfoil, it's a native milfoil. Really pretty. And we've already talked about algae. This is an actual photograph of Spider Lake algae. This was from the Great Lakes Environmental Center here in town. Carol facilitated getting some samples identified. This is a filamentous algae called Spirogyra. And it's called Spirogyra because if you see the chloroplast here, it's a little spring, like a spiral, all the way up. They're really pretty. And so this was one of the 3 species that they found, all native, all beneficial. Plants in your lake. And I always, plants are underappreciated, both the big ones and the little ones. And so, those of you who went on the pontoon ride with us last year, heard me wax eloquent about how plants are so cool and interesting, but they really are, and they have a lot of benefits to our lake. So just a little quick bit on plant appreciation. They really protect the bottom and the shoreline of our lakes. If we have a lake like this that has some plants on the bottom, what we find is that the stems and the leaves can break the force of waves coming in. We see the sediment actually depositing and staying clear. If we have a lot of plants, lakes tend to be clearer than lakes that don't have many plants, because every time a boat or the wind goes by, it stirs up all those sediments, makes it a lot cloudier, reduce water clarity. We see our shoreline is protected. Let's say here's a shore over here and there's waves coming in. Waves are coming in, they hit those reeds and they're gonna just really get dampened, and your shoreline is protected because you have those nice reeds and other plants in your lake. Of course, fish, love it, snails, love it, bugs, love it. It's really important, you know, if you spend any time fishing, you know this, or even swimming, going with your snorkel mask and just take a look and you know where the fish are gonna be. They're not gonna be out there in that desert of no plants. They're gonna be where the plants are. They produce oxygen in the lake. We just talked about how valuable oxygen is. You know, they're a green plant just like a tree, so they're releasing oxygen into the lake. That helps keep the lake clear and healthy. They also use up those nutrients. So if some phosphorus gets into your lake, the plants will use it up and you won't get a big algae bloom in your lake. They're a competition for algae. What I've seen in a lot of lakes that have gotten aggressive with plant management and herbicide application where they've wiped out a big section of the leafy plants in their lake, they're replaced by algae, because there's still the nutrients in the lake. They didn't deal with the nutrient issue, so there's fertilizer in there for something. If there's no leafy plants, the algae is going to grow with it. So that's a trade-off. No leafy plants, more algae. And of course, that leads to water quality, and you have a little cartoon here of a lake with nice plants, and it's nice and clear. Get rid of the plants, now it's green and full of algae that is at nuisance levels. So, and as I mentioned, it's beautiful if you get in there. You know, if you really take a look and see, Spider Lake has a lot of different types of plants in it. They're beautiful, they have all different shapes and forms, and it's really neat to just get in there and take a look. And encourage your kids, your grandkids to go put their mask on and go swimming around. You know, they're gonna, you know, even if they start out going, ooh, plants are gross, pretty soon they're gonna pull them out and start showing them to you. Like, oh, look at this one I found. It's gonna be really cool. So, you know, to maintain plants in your lake, again, you know, this diagram shows you that, you know, here's your house, walking down to the lake. It's okay to maintain part of that shoreline so you can swim and get your boat out. But then on the edges, if you're not using that for boating or swimming, let those plants thrive, let them grow there. Also, keeping plants up on the upland can prevent erosion and also is great habitat. And so all of that is really important for our lakes. We've talked about invasive species. There was mention of the boat washing stations. You might have experienced my boat washing crew that came last year to Spider Lake at the boat launch. They're up at Lake Charlevoix today at the Venetian Festival washing boats, and the other crew I think is on Lake St. Clair, so I've got them all over the state today. Cleaning boats, talking to people about invasive species. We really hope that every lake is out there looking for invasive species and learns at least the key invasive species like starry stonewort. This is actually an algae, a macroalgae that looks more like a leafy plant that is kind of moving its way north in Michigan, so we want people to be aware of it. I mentioned earlier that Oakland County down by Detroit chipped in and got a lot more lakes involved. Last year, it was more like 15 or 16 lakes discovered starry stonewort because they joined our program last year. They didn't know they had it until they did this. Now they're able to take steps to stop it because it grows super quickly and outcompetes our native plants.
Joe, at your Bear Lake presentation, there was significant talk about the fast reproduction of this plant. Do you mind hitting on that, just to emphasize how invasive some things can be?
Oh yeah, I mean, we're talking about a plant that can grow from like, you know, a patch 1 year to 2 acres the next year to 8 acres. I watched a lake in Lansing that is managing it. They're spraying for it. And they've been doing exotic aquatic plant watch every year, and they have 85 sampling sites, and they've gone from having 4 sampling sites with starry stonewort to 83 of their 85 sites in the lake. They find starry stonewort, and that's only in 5 years. So we're still, the people who manage this stuff and figure out the chemistry and how to kill it, we're still trying to figure this one out. It's a real challenge, and so there's not an easy fix for this stuff. The way you keep it from start, you know, you keep it out in the first place. You clean the boats that are moving in, because these little stars, you can see the tiny little things. There's these little white specks you can see. They look like stars, and that's why it gets its name. And these are the little reproductive structures. So these grow down, are down in the sediment if you pull up this plant, and they fly off, you know, and they settle everywhere, and they can sit in the sediment for years, unfortunately, before they grow. So they can spread really quickly. Interestingly, it's from Europe where it's endangered, but it's thriving here. I think just send it back. They probably like it too. So, you know, people often ask us about plant management, and, you know, we talk about, really for long-term control, it's about the watershed and reducing runoff, preventing things from coming in on boats and fishing gear and that kind of thing. I'm just gonna mention this because I think it's hilarious. I've been doing this boat washing program for 6 years. My crews have been all over the state for the last 6 summers. And we had a first this year. The first time ever, my crews texted me a video, like, this is a first. And I looked at it, and they had on their mat with their big power washer, they're hosing down one of those giant inflatable unicorns. I mean, unicorns flopping around, they're always big down. But that gets moved from water body to water body too. So, we wash jet skis, kayaks, canoes, fishing boats, pleasure boats, pontoons, but we've never washed a unicorn. All right, so, we try and, again, this slide also mentions just, looking at all aspects, and application of herbicides is one tool in a toolbox. So is manually harvesting, pulling them out with a rake, doing it by hand. There's suction harvesting with divers that's done some places. But of course, that top part, the prevention and the watershed management, is important as well. And then I did add a couple slides. We've talked a little about shorelines already, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time. But we talked to people about how they're managing their shorelines and also their uplands to maintain that lake health. And thinking about that as your whole property, things you can do. And so, our number one recommendation, if you have nature, keep it. It's already there. You don't have to do anything. That's the easiest thing. If you have, then keep it. If you don't, there's things to think about. What can you reintroduce? A lot of people find themselves with a property like this. Maybe you have a couple trees, but it's mostly lawn. Maybe you have a beach the whole length of your shoreline, and you're wondering, what can I do to get my score the shore up a little bit? What can I do to improve it? And so, this is just one example. That Shoreline Partnership website that I talked about has lots of ideas and examples of things that you can do. And you can start small, do a little bit at a time. Simple thing, people will just stop mowing an area. You don't know necessarily what's going to come up and whether you're going to think it's attractive or not, but that's one thing you can do. Or you can learn about good native shoreline plants for this area and actually plant some things. There's a lot of things that you can do to slowly move to a more natural shoreline. Here's an example of someone who did just that. This is kind of the before picture here. Then after, they kind of step back from the shoreline a little ways. They put in a nice little, edging there, so you could tell it wasn't just, oh, I'm going to stop mowing, and your neighbor goes, what's that guy doing? He doesn't care anymore. You can put in some nice landscape effects so you know that it's intentional. And they planted a lot of new plants that will fill in this area. Pretty soon they won't even need that mulch there because they pick things that are going to fill in and create a nice buffer zone along the lake shore. And then you end up with something like this over time. You can add some cone flowers and other things that will bloom throughout the summer that are attractive. And you can still have some lawn. But you can imagine, this is a particular example because they've got a pretty good slope there. But yet they have this nice buffer there that's going to help. Yeah. All right. That's it. So there's my contact information. If you want to reach me, please feel free to reach out. Like I say, I'm kind of local, so it makes it a little easier if you wanted to meet up and talk about some things that are going on, or if there's other programs that are happening in the area. I always make sure that folks like your president Rhonda knows what's going on. If there's a workshop or something going on, or a training you might be interested in. And I would also encourage you to consider every spring there's a lake conference. The Michigan Lake Stewardship Association holds their annual conference. It'll be at Crystal Mountain at the very beginning of May next spring. That's where we do the training for our volunteer program. So Crystal Mountain, not that far away, but then there's also a lot of really great sessions about lake protection, lake science, lake management. It's also a good chance to talk to people from other lakes about what they're doing, what's worked, what hasn't worked, everything from how to get people to come to your annual meeting to how to have a better fishery, all of that stuff is talked about there. And this next spring, it's going to be a kind of a bonus meeting because the MLSA is holding it jointly with the Michigan Inland Lakes Partnership, which is like the DNR, MSU, a lot. So it's going to be an extra day in length. It's going to be a really great event. So soon the Save the Dates will come out about that. So I encourage you to go to that.
And that was a great program. Patty, Carol, and I went out for a day and went through
That's
the
right,
education.
yeah.
And then Bill did the training for testing.
Yep. So I don't know how we're doing time-wise for a few questions.
Move on.
We do?
We do.
Well, thank you so much.